Austin 316 says I just whipped your ass.
And what's it gonna do?
It doesn't matter how you're doing. Woo! Wheeling, dealing, limousine right, jet flying.
Can you dig it, sucker?
Would you please shut the hell up?
You don't know what hard times are, Daddy.
The cream will rise to the top, oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Look at the human rubble!
Welcome to Keep the Kayfabe. Once again, we're taking it old school, and once again, it's me, the Mecca of manhood, Steve, along with the... That's not funny. You don't need to laugh at that.
You did not just say that.
I did just say that.
You literally just said that.
I stole that from Terry Taylor.
I mean, this show's starting off on the wrong foot.
Well,
I'm just telling you.
I regret to inform you listening that my partner in crime, as always, when we take it old school, is the one and only Ohio outlaw Gary.
That's right. This is the anniversary year of the Midnight Rider in the NWA WCW in 1988. This is the anniversary year, so I shall next time be under mask, and you won't be able to tell, because they ain't gonna let him catch me. No, they ain't gonna let him catch the Midnight Rider next time. So
that's perfect.
You won't recognize me,
and
even though I'll sound the same and I'll look the same except for the mask, but you won't be able to recognize me.
And it'll be the theater of the mind. You can just imagine the mask.
That's right.
Now,
enough of this foolishness. Enough of this foolishness.
Yes, Gary. We spent a whole show last time talking about 1 year. One year. But that's the beauty of wrestling. Like, we filled the time talking about it. It was a pretty foundational year, I think was the best way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was 1980. And for those of you that listened, we covered the epic Bruno Larry Zbyszko, like where Larry, the mentor or the mentee, turned on his mentor.
Yeah.
Heinous action that shot heard around the world. The epic title reign of Harley Race, with a little hiccup where he lost to Giant Baba. Ric Flair winning his first belt. Hogan Andre with their first dalliance long before WrestleMania 3. That was 1980, and we're going to spend the whole time talking about 1981, which, again, I think that it's like like we were saying before we recorded, it's the chess pieces were being put into place. It's like there's a lot of stuff that kind of would have ripples through wrestling through the 80s.
It was a really interesting year when we were doing our research, because there really wasn't a ton out there about 1981, but the things that were out there that we're going to talk about tonight really were impactful in retrospect, right? Like, again, at the time, very innocent. Many of these things were very innocent, but now looking back, there were some pretty pivotal moments in 1981 that eventually obviously led to what I think we'll know as more of the glory years of the 80s, was 82 to 88. That was really, you want to talk about, it wasn't even hot. It wasn't even white hot. It was inferno wrestling at the time, between 82 and 88. But it is interesting year, because it really was 80 had a lot of excitement and a lot of buzz around, as you mentioned, Shea Stadium, the big shows, the things that were going on with Harley Race. But then in 1981, a little bit of a lull, but boy, some of these things were really huge.
Well, let's get into 1981, if you will. The year is 1981, and some things happened, such as MTV launched, and
isn't that crazy to think?
Yeah, and actually show the music was the emphasis. There was a lot of music videos. Some movies. My perhaps favorite movie of all time, Raiders of the Lost Ark, came out. Cannonball Run, classic comedy.
Classic.
Superman 3, kind of more infamous, not a great movie. Chariots of Fire.
Wait, is Superman 3 the one with Zod?
No, that was 2. That was fantastic.
Oh, 2 was
3
really
was with
good.
Richard Pryor.
Oh, yeah.
They couldn't even have the decency. I don't think they even had
that was
Gene Hackman in his last.
Yeah, that was not good. 2 was good.
Yes, 2 was perhaps my favorite because Zod was amazing. Chariots of Fire, big Oscar winner. The internet was, as a term, what kind of first bandied about and mentioned.
When I saw that, I was just floored because I'm like, gosh, you're right. Like, do you remember the old St. Mary's? The two of us, we were in the computer room, right, and playing Oregon Trail, and
yes,
during computer days, it was supposed to be library days. Oh gosh, what memories that was!
Sure is. Look where we are now.
Yeah, Muhammad Ali retired. That was big.
Right.
That
I mean,
big.
I think for those that really followed boxing, that's probably long overdue because his last few years were pretty rough, like Larry Holmes fight and all that. But
you and your dad loved boxing.
I was really into boxing in the 80s and early 90s, and but speaking of boxing, the fictional kind, I think a movie that's well worth noting was filmed in 81, Rocky 3. And that kind of brings us to our first topic, because those of you who remember, first of all, it was a huge hit. Like, I mean, the Rocky movies were all, like, those first 3 were all renowned, but this is the one that kind of put it in almost even more the mainstream. And there was a particular figure that kicked the movie off in an exhibition match with Rocky. That was a larger than life figure by the name of Thunder Lips.
Thunder Lips.
And I still, honestly, to this day, can remember going to the movie theater with my dad and my brothers to see that. And we didn't really know who the guy playing Thunder Lips was. And we were just like, oh, we just thought that scene was so cool. It was like, and he was just a beast, this big muscle bound dude. And then at the end, when he's done with his fight, he's like super nice and takes a photo with him.
Right.
It's a great little scene. But for those of you that don't know what we're talking about, Thunder Lips was played by none other than Hulk Hogan.
Yep. And so, I mean, this is perfect segue into what I think is probably one of the mainstay topics of 1981, which is the emergence of Hulkamania. So you remember, we're going to go back in time just for a bit. We mentioned it before, but Hogan-Andre feuding in 1980 culminated at Shea Stadium. Hogan then also had matches where he was the one who beat Gorilla Monsoon in Gorilla Monsoon's retirement match. And the thing, at this time, you have to suspend a little judgment in realizing that Hogan was a heel. Like, he was managed by Johnny Valiant, Freddie Blassie in the WWF, then eventually Johnny Valiant in the AWA. So he was a mainstay heel.
Right.
And so, but here, unbelievably fascinating, right, Steve? He and Vince McMahon Sr. get into, in essence, as history kind of unfolds. And again, for the listeners, like, Steve and I are not pretending in any way stretch of the imagination to be like perfect experts about wrestling, but in this revisionist history that we're doing, as the story is told, the essence of it is Vince McMahon Sr. gets upset at Hulk Hogan because he's going to Hollywood, which is unbelievable given where the WWF is today.
Oh, yeah, well, they encouraged it, and they have their own movie studio. Yeah. It's funny. I found a quote from Hulk Hogan in an interview he did a couple years ago, and I'll just read it. But he said the mindset back then wasn't like it is now. They were Stone Cold could go and do a TV show, and they were happy with it. You could go do the Expendables, The Rock doing what The Rock did. But he said back in 78, 79, if you were a wrestler, you didn't do TV. You didn't go to do a movie. If you were a wrestler, you were a wrestler.
Yes.
And, that was it.
And Steve, I mean, think about the shot in the movie, which is that he's playing this character and then even breaks kayfabe in the movie slightly, although slightly, he breaks kayfabe and shows you this other side of a wrestler.
Yeah.
And, and that wasn't, and there's another person that we're going to talk about a little later, Sergeant Slaughter, but also we go back to, 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, early 80s wrestling. You went by your name or the pseudonym. Like, there wasn't there were a few character-based wrestlers, but mainly it was a name, and they literally were wrestlers. And even to think about where Hogan does end up, because he gets in this argument with Vince McMahon Sr., and basically Vince McMahon Sr. is like, I'm done with you. So he's going to push him to first I think he wanted to push him to Mid-Atlantic, but then Hogan found his way to the AWA with
Right.
Vern Gagne. And I think this is a really good time for you and I to talk about the AWA, because, you know, this moment in time, 1981, and the emergence of Hulk Hogan, was the best of times and the worst of times for the AWA.
Absolutely.
You know, Vern was an Olympic athlete himself, a wrestler, and he was a wrestler. And he was the quintessential territory person, just like Fritz von Erich and others before them, where it was his territory. He was doing a lot of the training, and he also was the champion. And one thing that we'll come to know about Vern is there was definitely a difficulty when he walked into a room, because he had quite an ego, a very
sure.
stubborn ego.
Right.
And so, you know, who are, you know, you think about, you know, some of the people that Vern trained, right? Like Ric Flair, the Iron Sheik, obviously his son, Greg Gagne, Jim Brunzell. He trained, you know, Ken Patera. Like these, it was legit. And it was the class. Ricky Steamboat, I think, might have been in that school or around that time. But I mean, these guys tell stories about doing hundreds of wall sits, and they have this huge home in Minnesota where they're training in a barn in the middle of the winter below zero. Like, you want to talk about definitely a different from where it was to NXT and you know, and developmental
the state
today.
Of the art, and
not even close.
They go, you know, in their downtime, they play video games and stuff. Nothing wrong with that, but I mean, it was just like, this was like hard knocks. And it's like, you know, you hear stories about Stu Hart in his dungeon, but Vern,
Exactly.
I mean, this had the kind of a dungeon of his own.
Yeah.
I even remember watching a random episode of AWA from, you know, the 80s on the WWE network, and Vern would even have these little moments in between the segments where he would give tips on working out or doing things in your house, like with the door frame, like, you know, pull-ups and stuff. And it was just like, I mean, there was like this different mentality of fitness, and he was, and so many big names passed through the AWA. I mean, that just, I mean, it was a big deal.
It was a very big deal.
It's certainly my earliest memories of wrestling, because, you know, I'd watch it on Sunday mornings with my dad. Because Milwaukee was the territory, part of the territory.
Exactly. We were in the heart of that territory. You know, we were in the heart of the AWA. So, and, you know, again, you have to like remember back in 1981, like the emergence of cable was beginning, right? But it was still like, Steve, I don't remember. It had to be in the mid 80s when we all actually got cable television, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so, like, you only had local channels, so whatever was on the local channel is what you saw. And so our world view of wrestling was the local AWA, because that was our territory.
For sure.
Every once in a while, right? I remember Windy City Wrestling. You'd catch on.
Oh my gosh!
Just barely catch it, because you could almost get the PB. I think it was the WFLD channel 32. You could kind of get it on the antenna from Chicago, and it depended on the day. And so sometimes you could get Windy City Wrestling, but more often than not, the vast majority of wrestling we saw at that point was the AWA.
This is hilarious, because if there's people younger than us that like, what are you talking about antennas? And like, like, I mean, I feel like I'm suddenly like talking like some ancient person that we had like 6 channels, and you had to, you know, your antenna,
literally,
like, and our house had an antenna that was taller than the house, that we had a dial that would, like one of those big antennas. But but you're right, you're lucky if you could catch it. And no, but AWA, man, that was where it was at. And but even so, even though we could rattle off some names, like, you know, that passed through the AWA, the Road Warriors, the Fabulous Ones, some things we've mentioned before, but they kind of, you'd think, lucked into this like red hot Hulk Hogan, But I think as a theme, as we're talking about it, it's like they didn't really, it's part Vern's ego, part everything, but they didn't. I don't even think they knew what they had on their hands with him.
Yeah, I mean, so also within 1981, you got to remember Vern Gagne, he himself decides to retire from the ring, and ironically puts himself over, and so retires as the champion. And then, as history and research shows, he literally just handed the title over to Nick Bockwinkel, who he was feuding with.
Right.
You think about just the ego that played in, like, today, how many retirement matches, even from the Undertaker, Ric Flair, I mean, all these guys, the last AEW show, pay-per-view, almost every veteran put over a young talent in that show.
Or you're right. Like Kurt Angle. I mean, there were wrestling fans that were outraged by it, but of course, his last match he put over Baron Corbin because that's what you did. And it's like, but Vern, I think it's ego. I think it was this maybe even lack of trust, because it seemed like guys like him, when they were actually running and founded the company, their safe zone was to put it back on themselves.
Well, yeah, because
that was Vern.
At the end of the day, right? They literally owned the territory and all of the money. I mean, everything was coming through them. So when push came to shove and he felt like he needed to bring a spark in, and we'll talk about this probably maybe not 82, but definitely either 83 or 84, about world class. Fritz von Erich did the same thing with the Von Erichs, right? Like, and it was an easy, whoopee of sorts that they could fall back on, and Vern Gagne will insert himself in a couple of matches in the next couple of years and over, so because
doesn't fully go away, because
he never does.
He needs to. Yeah, he needs to stay there. Yeah.
But to think that the guy that owned the territory would then wrestle in his last retirement match, win with the title, and then just kind of hand it over. It was a bizarre.
He didn't need to. I mean, he was a made man. He was a legend. Like, he could have walked away in defeat to Nick Bockwinkel. Simple, tale as old as time. But no, he couldn't even bring himself.
To do it. It's like, come on, man. And so, but you know what? Vern Gagne also really didn't know what he had with Hogan, because he started Hogan as a heel, just like he was. He put him with Johnny Valiant, and then all of a sudden, it was as if there was just something about Hogan, and he becomes this massive babyface. And I think there's a classic run-in with Jerry Blackwell. Something was going on, and he caught unbelievable fire. And so he and Mean Gene Okerlund did series of promos and matches. I mean, boy, you talk about just energy. Like, Hogan completely captivated people at this point in this little area of Minneapolis, which basically was from, it kind of went a little west, but in essence, it was Minnesota, it was Wisconsin, it was Illinois, Iowa, some of the Dakotas, Colorado. I mean, and then a little bit into Canada, right? But their territory, was in these more vast areas. And, and Hogan, you look back on some of those matches, like I have gone back and watched a few of the classic matches. Andre shows up in the territory and he's teaming with Andre. This is one of the first real feuds for Hogan was with the Heenan family. Yeah. And this is where Bobby Heenan emerges as this character who continues to throw, people in front of Hogan. And you want to talk about a tale as old as time, because that tale will start in 1981, and then eventually you will see it into the later 80s with the Heenan family and Hogan, even into the WWF.
Yeah, and then even vestiges of it in WCW, because they all follow kind of, Hogan, Mean Gene, Heenan. And it's funny, and not to get too off topic, but it's funny when when Hogan did his big, shot heard around the world heel turn in WCW,
Mm-hmm.
he came out looking like he was going to help the good guys.
Yeah.
And Heenan, because he was playing this character that started in the early 80s, was like, yeah, but what side is he on? And people at the time were like, oh, he kind of ruined it. But no, he was playing Heenan. Like he was Hogan was the thorn in his side for going on 20 years at that point.
Yes.
So yeah.
So I would just urge a lot of younger fans of wrestling to go back and just kind of YouTube some of the classic AWA stuff from 1980, 81, 82, because you talk about a territory that had caught fire. They caught fire. It will come to see that it is short-lived, however, because of Vern Gagne and his ego and his inability to relinquish control. Also, his inability to see that Olympic style grapplers were running their course.
Yeah.
Because Hogan now represents the first true character entertainer that was really mainstreamed. And I think that was a battle that Vern Gagne could not overcome. He's like, no, you have to do 1,000 wall sits. No, you have to climb up the stairs and all of this stuff, right? And that's how you train, and you train on a dirt mat, all of that stuff. He just couldn't imagine wrestling not being entertainment.
Right.
It's unfortunate because
it is.
Because it obviously we know where history is going to lead itself, but they truly had something special, especially in the late part of 1981. And then, the next conversation we have about 1982, boy, Hogan is red hot, and there's going to be some really cool kind of things that we'll be able to talk about in 1982. But yeah, the birth of Hulkamania really is an interesting phenomenon because
and it started somewhere else.
It did. It really did start somewhere else. It started by accident, and truly, it started. And it's so ironic, really, because when you think about it, it's Vince McMahon Sr. getting ticked off at Hulk Hogan for being in an entertainment industry.
Yeah, mainstream appeal. Yeah,
you want to talk about the irony of ironies, right? And only to know that in a few short years, Vince McMahon will literally blow the top off of professional wrestling, and it almost completely shifted into the entertainment industry.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's just a pivotal transition.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, well, and it's funny too. I mean, I think you brought up earlier, like this emergence of character wrestlers that the WWE would just make, that would be their signature for 15, 20 years. Sergeant Slaughter is another name that was making some moves and shakes in the 1980 or 81 year.
Yeah. I mean, 1981 was a big year for Sergeant Slaughter. In fact, looking back, and this is again, if people are in their late 40s like you and I are, and they have these vivid memories of certain wrestlers. We talked about this a little bit before we got on, but the people that we're going to talk about over the course of the next 15, 20 minutes, like Sergeant Slaughter, Pat Patterson, Andre, Killer Khan, we're probably going to, we'll even, throw in Ken Patera to some degree, right? Like these wrestlers, that we kind of really clued into at the end of their career were the pivotal pieces of wrestling at this time. I mean, think about Ric Flair, Roddy Piper, Greg Valentine, those guys, Dusty Rhodes, they're coming into their own. They are today's MJFs. They're today's Darby Allins. They're today's Roman Reigns. Like they're literally coming into their own. Austin Theory, right? Like it is so interesting to think about. We we witnessed the birth of these entities, these characters, and these wrestlers, and they're now coming into their prime.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sergeant Slaughter was a fascinating one because, again, the WWF really began to unveil like this notion of character wrestlers, right? Everybody typically, Bob Backlund, Ken Patera, even Andre the Giant, Hulk, they were going by their names, and it was really seen still as wrestling. And Sergeant Slaughter was one of the very first, character wrestlers. He was this, this
drill
military,
sergeant,
this military entity that comes in and is going to try to bring law and order into wrestling. And so but what's really cool about this moment is just thinking about the script that the WWF is going to start to play now in terms of these characters and the way they really became known for, in a good way and sometimes not so good way, almost forgetting about the legacy of the human, the person,
right,
and just moving in this direction of now more of a comic book character as opposed to a real life superhero.
Well, and that arc, it just is interesting because, like we said, WWE rides this to like good and bad. Like, they embrace that, and then they like, even to the point where like some legend like Barry Windham will return to the WWF where he had been before, and they act like he's a new guy. Like they call him the Widowmaker, like stuff like that. They started doing. It's like, come on. It's like, I know you got to own the name, but it's also interesting, and it's a topic for a different day, that they, like anything, they made this, like they hitched their wagon to it in the 80s and 90s, but then come late 90s, it started getting really corny and ran its course. And then WWCW did the opposite. Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, they're calling people by their real names. And that's, then they took over. So it's just the ebb and flow of wrestling.
Yeah. And I'm guessing, right, we're going to see, X number of years from now, another change, right? That's going to bring us almost back. But one of the key stories of Sergeant Slaughter was with Pat Patterson. So we alluded to it a little bit in the 1980 episode, but Pat Patterson is making this transition from in-ring and basically he switched spots with Bruno Sammartino. So Vince McMahon is the play-by-play, and you've got the color guy who is Bruno Sammartino. Larry Zbyszko, gets all up in Bruno's shorts, and so they feud, and so Bruno leaves his position in terms of announcing and gets into the ring and really starts to battle with Larry Zbyszko. At this time, Pat Patterson is now, moving away from being a full-time wrestler, and now he takes over as color commentator for WWF shows. And what's again so interesting is that at that time, I felt Pat Patterson was older, right?
Yeah.
And then to think about where he evolved to, over the rest of his career in terms of the sheer genius that he brought.
Inventing the Royal Rumble, all this stuff. Yeah.
I mean, it's unbelievable to think about. I wonder, obviously you go back to 1981, that's when you want to talk about the band got together. Vince McMahon, Howard Finkel, Pat Patterson, Gorilla Monsoon will join them soon. They all started emerging as non-wrestling entities and personalities, but these became staples of the WWF leadership for the next 3 decades.
Exactly. Well, I don't think you understand the severity of the situation between Sergeant Slaughter and Pat Patterson. Sergeant Slaughter called him yellow.
He did.
I mean, you don't do that.
You don't do that.
Yeah.
And he slapped him. I mean, I can't believe it. He slapped him, and he got him angry, and then they got into this. A tale as old as time. The old, well, you can't get out of the Cobra Clutch.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, there's so many examples of that. Even going into the 2000s, it's like I was thinking about. I think Hercules did that with his backbreaker.
Did.
I think Chris Masters did that with the Master Lock in the 2000s. And it's
Andre,
just the classic.
Big John Studd, you
Big
can't
John
slam
Studd,
me.
bear hug,
You
and
can't
all that.
slam me.
It's these tropes that they go to. It's just so great. I love that they never fully go away. You can't break my move.
You can't break my move. And so he does. Yeah. And then of course Slaughter, gets upset. And so I actually, not unbeknownst to me, and thinking about the podcast that we're doing right now on 1981, but I had actually seen not too long ago the Madison Square Garden alley fight between Sergeant Slaughter and Pat Patterson, and didn't realize it at the time I was watching it, just the significance of it. I just was watching it because I was, just kind of going through, but it was a bloody affair.
Oh my gosh, I can imagine.
And I believe at the time Slaughter was managed by the Grand Wizard, and the Grand Wizard had to throw in the towel, and then it led to the end of the feud in essence, and in many ways it led to the departure of Sergeant Slaughter for Mid-Atlantic and the NWA, which again, remember at the time, wasn't that uncommon, right?
Because no, they shifted around,
yeah, you would run your course in a certain area, and then as a massive heel, you would, in his case, now he gets shifted to go to another territory, and he in essence shared with them so that they can then use him, and he goes on a really long U.S. championship run.
Yeah, beats Ricky Steamboat and then Jay Youngblood and others in the tournament to win it right away, and he holds on to it for like you said, like 7 months.
Yeah, and then we'll come to know Sergeant Slaughter then almost overnight becomes a massive babyface and is a champion for the United States. And we'll probably get into that later, but when nationalism takes over in our country and these nationalistic principles come out, and he becomes the larger than life G.I. Joe superhero.
Right. Until he turns his back on his country during the Iraq War. But that's a topic for another
That's another podcast. That's another era.
But why don't we, let's speaking of larger than life figures, I mean, if we take it back to the WWF, Andre the Giant, it's kind of an odd feud. We were talking about this before we record, with kind of an interesting character, Killer Khan.
Yeah.
He's, probably not a lot of people remember him. Funny enough, he's still alive. I was surprised to see that. He's 76.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this guy from Japan. But
gosh, when I
wasn't that old in the 81.
He felt like it just seemed like he was really old.
But no.
Maybe it was the Champions of the Galaxy Genghis Khan character.
He looked old. Yeah.
Oh, if anyone knows that reference, I would give him $5 if you knew the reference we just said, and you make a mention on any of our social media platforms of where Genghis Khan and Killer Khan reference comes from, then you get $5 from me. I'll get it over to you.
Yes.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, so a real life thing happens, and Andre has an accident and breaks his ankle, in real life, and I don't want to lose the significance of this, because in doing research and in the realization of this, Andre was literally larger than life. And we know that he had that debilitating disease where he just kept growing and everything. Mm-hmm. The other thing about Andre, though, was he did not get cheated socially either. And we know that he legendary mass consumptions of beverages. What were those? The Coneheads or something like that? I think it was a Saturday Night Live skit with the Coneheads when they would pop open a 6-pack of beer and mass quantities of.
He definitely liked his daddy sodas, as they say.
He loved his daddy sodas, and so, Andre literally is now going to be embroiled in a feud that stems from a real life injury that they play up with Killer Khan. It ends up being the feud of the year. In fact, one of the matches of the year as rated by the Observer in 1981. But it's also, I think, going to be the beginning of the end for Andre, because I think this injury, again, if you weren't aware of where Andre, if you only knew Andre at the end of his life, you could not even have imagined that he used to do drop kicks. He used to come off the top rope. He would come off the rope. He was extremely agile. And in just doing this research, you come to realize that his mobility really, really gets impacted with this ankle injury. And in essence, Andre is not the same after this accident.
No, I mean, even the legendary, Vince still got a lot of mileage out of him, because WrestleMania 3 main event is probably one of the biggest events ever in wrestling. But when you really sit and think about it, Andre was not in good shape for that match.
He was not.
And he still went a few years after that. And it was sad. I mean, I think you said it's the injuries. It's the simple fact that, he died in his 40s, and that was longer than he expected to live.
Right.
So it was a rough life for him.
It was. And it's a bit sad because just a year earlier in 1980, he is literally in a red hot feud with Hulk Hogan, and he is touring the country, and he is, I happened to watch that match, and you see how agile almost Andre was in 1980. And then you get to later 81 and start of 82, and you just start to see him slow down. And then it just gets kind of sad from there, because like you mentioned, WrestleMania 3, which probably around what WrestleMania 3 would have been, I don't know.
I mean, was it 85?
85? I think WrestleMania 1 was it 83, 84, 85, something like that.
So 87 actually was.
87. Okay,
we're talking about in 81. The slowdown begins, and 6 years later.
So 6 years later,
he makes mega money with Hogan.
He does, but I think that his quality of life starts to deteriorate, and many people point to this incident where he broke his ankle and then started putting on weight, and then that weight was starting to impact his back, impacting his knees, and it just it was hard. It's you feel for it, because you just look back and you want to talk about a character and wrestler that just, to this day, it's hard to not know Andre the Giant.
Oh, I know. Yeah, he is. Yeah, just a household name. Yeah.
I do think, Steve, it's important as we kind of conclude 1981 for the WWF. It's important to kind of talk a little bit about Ken Patera.
Yeah.
You talk about another character. You and I would remember growing up as kids. It is a classic moment in the later 80s. Or was it night?
No, it was later 80s, because it was after all his, we'll talk about in a bit, but he had some legal trouble, or he went to jail and stuff. But then he attempted a comeback after that. And that's what you're referencing.
And the comeback is he's in the ring, and I think Heenan is basically kind of he was with Heenan, and then Heenan turns on him in essence, and the classic line, Steve.
Yeah, so there's I paid my debts to society. And then he was like, not one phone call, not one letter, not one visit. You completely abandoned me, Bobby. And
Great promo moment. I don't know why. For both of us, it struck us. We would repeat that. I paid my debt. I mean, I paid my
debts to society.
I can't even tell you how many times you and I would joke about that.
But I don't know. There are guys that had legal troubles and in jail and issues. But it was interesting at that time that they kind of used it as a storyline. Like, they acknowledged on TV that a baby face went to prison and learned from it. So it was kind of, I don't know, that was notable.
Yeah. Well, and again, thinking back now, Ken Patera was trained by Verne Gagne. He was an Olympic athlete, which is, again, true to form for Vern Gagne, Brad Riggins, Ken Patera himself, they were all Olympic athletes that he would then train into these professional wrestlers. But what's fascinating is just thinking about how over he was at one point in the late 70s and into 80, 81. In 81, he gets upset and he's known as a hothead,
Right.
and he basically gets upset with Vince Sr. and he had a long intercontinental championship run. He was also champion in St. Louis. I mean,
Yeah, it was funny. I mean, again, things unheard of nowadays. He was the Intercontinental Champion in WWF, but he was also the NWA Missouri Heavyweight Champion. Same time.
Time. And it just and I think what people need to realize also is the weight of the Intercontinental title so much greater in the 70s and 80s than it is today. The current IC champion is just kind of like I don't know, it's kind of a trophy. It's a prop. But back then it was the second champion, right? It was literally
that was where the next level Hulk, Macho Man, Mr. Perfect. That was like your wrestler that was like right on the cusp of like the next level was like your Ricky Steamboat, you name it.
Yeah, which also equivalent was the U.S. championship in the NWA. And,
a lot of prestigious people held that
ton of prestige with that title. And it's just kind of a sad indictment on where we've gone with some of those titles that they just become kind of more of a prop. But I think Gunther to some degree is kind of bringing back some of that.
I hope so. Cause I mean, he's amazing. So I hope they're doing that. Yeah.
But I mean, to the same token, but Ken Patera really takes a downturn here, and he was making really good money, probably really working a ton of territories. He was really, really a strong and over wrestler, and he makes this turn. He kind of leaves the WWF in 1981, eventually gets back to the AWA, and then we'll come to see that ironically in our home state of Wisconsin,
right?
I believe it was in Waukesha.
It was in Waukesha. April of 1984 is what you're referencing.
He and Mr. Saito get into a scuffle after hours with the McDonald's staff because they wouldn't serve them and they were hungry.
Yep, and they throw a rock through a window, and then they get into an altercation with, I believe, a female police officer.
Yep,
and
so he gets arrested.
Yeah,
and then people start to like back off him, and then in 1985 he actually gets sentenced to jail.
Yeah. So
and that was a big deal. I mean, because we were in the area, right? We were living in Milwaukee, and that was like a big thing. It was like, what's going on? And it also was interesting because what was interesting about this arrest was he and Saito, I think, were heels at the time.
Yes.
But it's not long after this arrest that another arrest occurs between the Iron Sheik and Hacksaw Jim Duggan for marijuana use.
Is much more controversial. It's a baby face and a heel together.
Yes. And so again, I think you have to like remember back then the veil of kayfabe was still very covered, and
right.
And so yes, that was a very big deal, and I remember reading it in the newspaper about Iron Sheik and Duggan getting arrested and
they fired him, I think, because they brought him back, but they fired him because the kayfabe thing. It was just like, you can't, this is two people that are supposed to be mortal enemies, and they're carousing out together after.
Oh, it's mind-boggling almost to think about
funny,
today. So
yeah.
Well, you love the NWA, so what's going on in there?
Well, it's sort of like the era. We keep alluding to the chess pieces, things changing around, but this year, there's lots of title changes, but this is when Ric Flair ascends to the next level, if you will, and starts, starts getting those championships, and he would be the dominant force there for the next decade plus. So yeah, I mean, everybody knows who Ric Flair is, and they know the stranglehold he had on the belt and all that. This is sort of where he takes that to the next level.
Mm-hmm. And it's weird to do research on 1981 and then realize where he will go over the next decade, right? I mean,
Right.
He will literally dominate, and he was quoted. Even then, he was quoted and said, Flair himself said, quote, "I'm not even sure I was ready. I still felt so green as a champion in 1981, but I grew so much." And I think that that's really an interesting reflection for Flair, because he was now the new traveling champion, right? And you talked about this in the 1980 episode, but that schedule was grueling. Like,
absolutely.
Unbelievably grueling. Like, they were literally on the road. And then
Well, we talked about
Flair-
that last week, or last time we recorded. Harley Race defending the title upwards of 19 times in a month.
And then Flair took this all to another level, because he started a tradition of our Broadways, and that was crazy. I mean, you're going to talk about just, it had to be unbelievably exhausting, and
I can't even imagine.
Can't even imagine. And and we can say whatever we want about Flair's lifestyle and the things that he did, but it's really hard to not look back on 1981 and realize the gift that he brought the wrestling fan.
Absolutely. And another notable thing that we talked about, or we noticed too, is that Roddy Piper becomes a heel announcer, which, to those of you listening that are more familiar with even the last 30 years, 20 years, of course there's a heel announcer. I mean, now it's a little bit of a tweener role, but for the longest time you had your baby face and your heel, Jerry Lawler, Jesse Ventura, you name it. But Piper, that was not a thing then. And he, I mean, we all know Roddy Piper, just a natural on the microphone and just one of the most charismatic people that ever graced wrestling. But yeah, he was a heel announcer.
Yeah, and it all stemmed from a bit of it was, I think it was at the Omni, not 100%, but I know that it was an interview between Bob and Brad Armstrong, and in essence, the way the interview was going is, they were kind of basking in the fact that they had, earned a lot of money, and they were these champions, and they, and Brad Armstrong was in essence kind of like, he wasn't bragging, but he's just like, yeah, and I took my money and I, bought a new car, and of course, in all his wit, which Piper was amazingly witty, amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah, just hard to. I mean, at least for me, I know I kind of liked heels. It's just impossible to not like.
Impossible. Like, his work in 81, 82, 83, 84, 85. I mean, his work is only going to get better from here.
Right.
But he then turns to Bob Armstrong and is basically like, so what kind of parent are you that would let their kid blow their money on a new car? And it just was something that, it was subtle. It was a dig. And people were like, what's this? Right. Because, the modern wrestling fan doesn't know wrestling without the classic playoff of each other. And for most of our childhood growing up, eventually we, Jesse Ventura plays this role and begins to play this role then in the WWF later. But this is the emergence of the first kind of anti-hero on the mic, and it becomes a shtick that sticks.
Absolutely.
It is interesting. We'll talk probably later on the 1982 episode, but there is a classic encounter with Gordon Soley, Don Morocco, and Roddy Piper, where he in essence turns babyface at this point. But he is just at this stage very much a heel, and I go back and I like to watch old Mid-Atlantic, and he's just dastardly. Like the things that he's doing, interfering, and he kind of plays this quasi wrestler, manager, kind of like figure, then announcer. So he really is starting to come into his own, and good for the NWA. And for Mid-Atlantic for thinking a little bit more progressively about how to use a character.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, getting to the end.
Yeah, and we like to point this out too, but we like to talk about some of the names that those of you that watch wrestling today might have heard of that were born this year, born in 1981. And to quote Gorilla Monsoon, reads like the who's who. Brian Danielson.
Yeah.
Prominent as every week on AEW. Finn Balor, just part of WrestleMania.
Which, if we could just digress for 30 seconds, his now more recent work. We're not always sure when this episode's going to drop, but his recent heel turn, just flawless.
Well, he is really he really has to go down as one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, and he is one of those guys that could just effortlessly go between heel and face and make both work. He is a pro at what he does.
Ric Flair will often talk about on his podcast, when asked who the greatest wrestlers are, he always points to two people, Shawn Michaels, and then the other is Ricky Steamboat. And the reason he says that Shawn Michaels better than Ricky solely based on the fact that Ricky could never have been a heel.
Right.
And
he not that he was one-dimensional, that marginalizes an all-time great, but he couldn't. Yeah.
He couldn't.
He was in one lane.
He was only in one lane. And so he only knew how to work the play the card of the victim of the match and just kind of have to work to overcome the mountains, right?
But Shawn
Michaels was great, but I'm telling you, Brian Danielson, unbelievable. His unbelievable professional ability to literally overnight switch to a heel and be so nasty. So
oh my gosh,
almost comical, but so nasty.
Right. It just works with him.
It does. Because you got like MJF now who's got the shtick of being a bad guy. I can't even imagine MJF becoming a good guy. So he's going to be limited in his career.
Right.
To some degree, right? Like I can't imagine, because part of it too is the blurred line today, not like in 80 or 81. There was very definitive black and white, heel and babyface. The modern wrestling, there's the tweener, and MJF is always going to vacillate in there a little bit.
Right.
But I just can't ever imagine him being a babyface.
No. Yeah, so Daniel Bryan, Finn Balor, two gentlemen that are not related, but Kofi Kingston and Eddie Kingston.
I didn't even think about that when we put that together, but
Kofi Kingston, Eddie Kingston, both, obviously Kofi Kingston, they finally gave his due a couple years ago, and he got his WrestleMania moment world championship. Yeah. Eddie Kingston toiled forever in the indie scene and finally found his home in AEW, where he's a beloved wrestler and he's a locker room leader too.
Yeah. Well, Finn Balor, you think about his match with Edge at WrestleMania. You don't realize how old he is because you don't really think about that. He's in phenomenal shape.
He is.
And he's clearly
always has been.
Clearly, nearing, he's, I don't necessarily wouldn't say he's at the top of his career, but he's pretty high up there in a pretty decent storyline.
Right.
And then just gets 14 staples or whatever in his head.
Oh my gosh.
But
look that photo up, folks, if you want to see something disgusting.
Yeah, it was crazy. But yeah, and then who debuts this year? This is just another one where I just am like, unbelievable. It's King Kong Bundy.
That's right.
He makes his first wrestling matches in 1981. And it's just so interesting to see. We'll have to probably find a way in either 82 or 83 to kind of highlight Bundy a little bit, but he was a great heel. Heel.
Absolutely. He proved to be one of the more memorable challenges thrown by Bobby Heenan, as you mentioned before. at Hulk Hogan. I mean,
Mhm.
and he would come back years later, and I think he was one of the Undertaker's opponents at WrestleMania on his
Yeah.
his
Oh,
long winning
that's right.
streak. So yeah,
The
he's
big
yeah,
the big blue cage.
yeah. So
WrestleMania 2.
he's no longer with us, but King Kong Bundy made an impact.
Well, I think we did a pretty good job on this 1981. Again, Steve, I look back and I think like, there wasn't much that went on, when I was doing the research. But then, boy, not only did we cover a lot of ground, but there were some really pivotal things, and it's hard to deny, that an innocent movie like Rocky 3 would be the
Catalyst.
thing that
Yeah.
is a catalyst for the future of what we'll know as today's wrestling, because
Right.
Hogan mainstreamed it in a way that no one else had ever. And unfortunately in 1981, fortunately or unfortunately, he's with Vern Gagne. And one of the things that we'll talk about, Hogan was never, ever AWA world champion.
No, they teased it, but then they just did
Teased it.
stupid shit. They sorry, pardon my language. They, he beat Nick Bockwinkel, but then they reversed it. I think twice. Dusty finish, and the second time he beat him, they took it away because he threw him over the top rope. Which for fans nowadays, there was a stretch of time in wrestling where throwing somebody over the top rope was an instant disqualification. So yeah, but they kind of jerked him around, and then again, that's that not seeing what they had. They should have just strapped a rocket on that guy, but they didn't.
They should have. And to Gagne's demise, in essence, he really, a lot of ways, alienated the fans by never putting a strap on him, and then eventually Hogan, other people another person will come to see the worth that Hogan could provide, and then the rest will be history. So,
oh my gosh,
yeah. So
yeah,
we conclude 81, and let's just a couple things about 80. So at the start of 1982, to foreshadow, a major player in pro wrestling, behind the scenes in the NWA, Sam Mushnick, is one of the calming, more mature, professional voices of reason out of St. Louis, retires and leaves the NWA leadership. And again, a blip on a radar screen in 1982 at the start. I mean, literally in January of 82, this is what's going to happen. But it will then be a domino effect, because there will not be that same voice of reason to replace him. And then when Vince Jr. starts to make his play, it just starts to create this chaos. And I think Vince Jr. benefits in a few years from the lack of these type of iconic promoters, and Sam Mushnick was one of them.
Yep. And I mean, you said it's like the NWA loses this key figure that is not easily replaced. And then other things, there's no territories in the California, like LA, San Francisco, Phoenix,
which is unbelievably mind-blowing. Like there's only wrestling. So at this point in big time wrestling is gone from San Francisco. So the only wrestling on the West Coast territory was Portland. So you think about all of that area. There's literally, I mean, the AWA, I think, was one of the first ones to kind of venture out to San Francisco. There's a classic when Kurt Hennig beat Nick Bockwinkel at the Cow Palace moment that will happen soon. But yeah, from Dallas, or from Texas, the world class in the Von Erichs, up to Memphis, then west there's no territory, like nothing.
Right.
And I think you and I both know, and will be able to talk about, just how eventually the emergence of cable TV and
those holes
explosion starts to fill the holes, and that area becomes ripe for the picking.
Yep. Yeah, we have. I mean, our theme here is talking about these foundational, like these starts of these names that are household names now. We talked about Flair, we talked about Slaughter, Dusty Rhodes really picking up some steam. Greg the Hammer Valentine, Bob Backlund, Hulk Hogan, Piper, all these guys we've mentioned. But yeah, I mean, you just talk about like all-time greats, all kind of hitting their stride right around the same time.
What'll be fun for 1982 is for us to spend some time on World Class, because
it's so great. Yeah.
From 82, basically 82 to 86, World Class was literally world class. Like that was one of the territories. And one of the most important factors was the fact that it was literally by satellite. It could be viewed all over the country.
Right.
And
that's
so
huge. That
foreshadowing some things to come. So
that's right.
Well, this was fun. I enjoyed our trip down 81. So I can't wait for 82.
Wow, this is beautiful because as we're proving, you can just spend whole times on years. It's like there's so much data to be mined, so much good stuff for us to talk about, and we will continue to bring this to you as only we can. And it's been a pleasure. And
pleasure.
We will pick this back up next time, wrestling fans.
1982 on the way.
That's right.